Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what I like to call the ultimate philosophical masterclass on, well, who you actually are. We're going to use some of the best visualizations out there to unravel one of the oldest, most baffling questions in human history, the persistence of the self. So, get focused and let's jump right into the mystery of your own identity.
Let's kick this off with a really personal, kind of provocative thought. Think about it. As you age, from an infant all the way up to an adult, the cells in your body are continually dying. They're constantly being replaced by entirely new building materials drawn from your environment, right? The food you eat, the water you drink. I mean, your physical appearance changes drastically. So, given this massive, continuous biological turnover, how can you possibly be the same person you were 10 or 20 years ago? What exactly is the you that persists?
This brings us to a legendary thought experiment known as the Ship of Theseus. Imagine the ancient hero Theseus owns this magnificent wooden ship. Over 1,000 years, the highly corrosive saltwater and various accidents mean it needs repairs. Piece by piece, plank by plank, the entire decking and all the wooden content of the ship are completely replaced. Now, the name remains the same, but the materials are entirely new. So in what sense is it still the same ship? This ancient puzzle challenges our most basic intuitions about identity, persistence, and essence. If you are entirely rebuilt, are you still you? To help solve this existential mystery, we structure this explainer into a 5-part syllabus to visually map out these massive ideas. We're covering 1. The puzzle of identity. 2. The Western soul. 3. Eastern views on self. 4. Secular and cultural selves. And finally, 5. The mind-body problem.
All right, let's move right into section 1, the puzzle of identity. Here, we'll examine the fundamental dilemma of how a thing can change without losing its core essence.
So biology attempts to answer our question first. Aristotle actually had this teleological view, basically the idea that things have a built-in end goal or purpose. This suggests the basic acorn-to-oak tree identity problem is solved by genetics. The purpose, or ergon, of the organism is present right from the very beginning in the zygote. This single initial cell holds all the genetic instructions for how the organism will develop. But while genetics can explain biological continuity, human identity, that undeniable feeling of being you, seems to require a much deeper framework than just a set of cellular instructions.
That brings us to section 2, the Western soul. Because if biology isn't enough, what about theology? Let's examine the Western concept of the soul.
In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the self is anchored by an eternal soul. The soul is the real self. And honestly, it solves the Ship of Theseus dilemma perfectly, because it continuously exists and is never replaced by basic building materials. Philosophically, this relies on the concept of substance, from the Latin substantia, which literally means that which supports or stands under. Drawing on Plato's forms and St. Thomas Aquinas' modification of Aristotle's cosmology, this worldview argues that God, acting as the necessary unmoved mover, gives contingent beings like us a static, enduring substance. It basically gives you a permanent soul that persists through physical change, and even straight into the afterlife.
Now for Section 3, Eastern Views on Self. We're going to shift our focus east to explore radically different, yet highly structured spiritual frameworks.
There's actually a massive philosophical divide even within Eastern traditions. On one side, you have Hinduism, which centers on the Atman, the eternal self or soul that has always been. The spiritual goal here is liberation, or moksha, which is achieved by realizing that the Atman is united with Brahman, the ultimate reality, through right actions like karma and dharma. But then, directly contrasted against this, the Buddha fundamentally rejected the concept of an eternal soul. Buddhism introduces the doctrine of anatman, the literal denial of the self. So, no permanent, autonomous being strongly individuated from others. The me is entirely ephemeral. To really grasp Anatan, we have to look at Buddhism's Four Noble Truths. Buddhism relies on the doctrine of dependent origination, which is this idea that the universe is a nexus of interdependencies where all phenomena are joined. Because everything is constantly changing, the first truth is that life is suffering, or dukkha. But here is the critical part. This suffering stems directly from our craving, or tanha, for things to be permanent. It's our craving for ontological persistence, meaning our desperate desire for a permanent, unchanging self, that literally causes our pain in a completely interdependent, ever-changing universe. Liberation, or nirvana, only comes when we follow the Eightfold Path and finally let go of that craving for a permanent self. So if you don't have a permanent soul, what are you? Well, instead of a static substance,
Buddhist philosophy beautifully models the self as 5 iterative processes, known as the skandhas, or aggregates. You are form, sensation, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. The self isn't a solid thing beneath these processes. Rather, the self is merely a temporary collection of these ever-changing aggregates constantly interacting with an interdependent world. In this view, you're really more of a verb than a noun.
Moving on to Section 4, Secular and Cultural Selves. Let's strip away theology entirely and examine how secular scholars and anthropologists attempt to define our identity using only observation and culture. Let's start with a fascinating anthropological view that completely challenges the Western assumption of an autonomous, isolated individual. Think about who you are without your friends, your family, or your community. The concept of Ubuntu from Southern African cultures suggests that you actually wouldn't exist without them. There's a famous Noni proverb that translates to, "A person is a person through other persons." It posits this beautifully undivided humanity. In this framework, blurring the boundary between self and other, your identity isn't something hidden deep inside you. It is literally constructed by your culture, your relationships, and your community. Simply put, you exist because we exist.
So this brings up a crucial point. If identity isn't just biological and it isn't a theological soul, could it be your memories? British philosopher John Locke proposed exactly this in a very famous thought experiment. Imagine a prince and a cobbler who have their consciousness and memories completely swapped. The body of the prince now holds the memories of the cobbler, and vice versa. Locke argued that the man in the prince's body is now truly the cobbler. This is the psychological continuity approach. Locke asserted that our identity is defined entirely by our consciousness, our reason, and our memories, not our biology.
But taking British empiricism to its absolute logical extreme, Scottish philosopher David Hume completely dismantled Locke's theories, along with the classic idea of substance. Hume argued that if you look closely inside your own mind, you never actually catch a permanent self. All you see are passing thoughts, feelings, and sensations. As he beautifully put it in his treatise of human nature, the mind is just a kind of theater where perceptions successively make an appearance in perpetual flux and movement. When we look at this comparison of Hume's bundle theory to the classical substance view of Aquinas or Locke, the difference is absolutely stark. While classical views require a static, enduring soul to uphold the qualities of a person, Hume said, no, there is no underlying substance. What we constantly mistake for an enduring self is actually just a rapid succession of different perceptions tied together only by resemblance and succession, masquerading as a unified entity. According to Hume, you are literally just a bundle of fast-moving impressions.
And that brings us to Section 5, the mind-body problem. Let's see how all of this builds to the ultimate paradox. Because if the self is the mind, or a bundle of perceptions within the mind, what exactly is the mind? And how does it interact with the physical brain? We have to weigh two massively conflicting worldviews here. On one hand, we have physicalism. This is the intuitive, modern scientific doctrine committed to the assumption that absolutely everything is physical. The mind is simply the brain. Nothing non-physical exists or has any physical effects. On the other side, we have René Descartes' famous 1641 theory of substance dualism. Descartes argued that the self actually requires two fundamental realities: the mind, which is a thinking thing or res cogitans, and the body, which is an extended, non-thinking thing or res extensa. Descartes associated your true identity entirely with that thinking, immaterial mind.
To test whether physicalism can truly explain the mind, philosophers use a brilliant thought experiment. Imagine Mary, a neurophysiologist who specializes in color. She knows every single physical, neurophysiological fact about how the brain processes color, but she lives entirely in a black and white world. One day, she steps out and sees a red apple for the very first time. So does she learn something new? Well, the physicalist has to answer no, because she already knew all the physical facts. But intuition tells us she absolutely learned something new, what it actually feels like to experience the color red. This challenges the whole idea that a purely biological explanation of the brain can ever truly capture the internal experience of consciousness.
And this brings us to the biggest hurdle for purely physical theories, including hard behaviorism, which claims mental states don't even exist, only observable behaviors do. Scholar Christoph Koch points out that consciousness is everything you experience. But more importantly, there is the experience of the experience itself. Philosophers call this qualia. Think of the throbbing pain of a toothache. The physical swelling is one thing, the behavior of wincing is another, but that vivid, first-person subjective feeling of the pain, the qualia, is entirely distinct. How on earth does physical matter create a subjective feeling?
Which brings us to the end of our masterclass. We've mapped out thousands of years of human thought here, from the biological zygote and the ship of Theseus, to the Western eternal soul and the Buddhist anathatman, all the way down to Hume's bundle theory and the profound mystery of qualia. So as we conclude this explainer, I'll leave you to ponder this final provocative question. Based on everything we've explored today, which framework truly defines the person you see in the mirror? Are you an eternal soul, a rapidly changing bundle of perceptions, or just a biological brain experiencing the phenomenon of life? Thank you so much for exploring with us, and keep questioning.